Good morning and welcome to the Best Practices webinar for Shared Spaces, hosted by the Office of Economic Workforce Development and produced by the virtual outreach team of the COVID Command Center. Language interpretation is available in Cantonese and Spanish. To enable language interpretation, please click the interpretation icon at the bottom bar of the window and choose the language channel that corresponds to your needs. Audio, video, and chat will be monitored and recorded. This event is being live streamed on Facebook. We respect all participants in this convening today and want to create a safe space for all. By default, all participants will be muted and video is disabled. Video will be on for speakers only. To participate in the chat, please select the chat button at the bottom of your screen. To submit questions, please send your chat questions to Q&A. San Francisco is experiencing a dangerous COVID-19 surge. You can take the following actions in order to save lives. By staying home as much as you can, do not gather with people from outside your household, whether indoors or outdoors. If you must go out, make sure to wear a mask. 1 in 3 people with COVID have no symptoms but can infect other people without knowing it. If you have been exposed to COVID-19 or have symptoms, please follow guidelines about quarantining. Support is available by calling 628-217-6101 or by calling 311. If you have symptoms or have been exposed to COVID-19 but don't have health insurance or can't get tested through your provider, visit sf.gov/gettestedsf or call 311 for information on getting tested at a city-run testing location. This is our agenda for today, and I hand the meeting over to Director Torres.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us again. Again, today we have a good group of participants on right now. Again, this is really to make sure that all of you who are joining us can both see this information, share it with your networks, to ensure that we're getting you clear, up-to-date information comprehensively about the programs that we have available to support the small business community. And so you have a great group of individuals who
Tenemos programas disponibles para la comunidad de negocios.
I believe we're seeing some of the translation happening on this line as well. So give us just one moment to correct that before we move on. So for Nick or anyone else, just in terms of making sure that as I'm speaking, the Spanish translation is taking place in those side areas for individuals to hear in those spaces, as opposed to in this conversation. Could I just have a vocal confirmation that that is taking place, and then I'll continue. Great, perfect.
Right here. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So again, the information that we are sharing today is, and then again, just for the group, I'm still seeing only the translator's name on the screen, not the agenda. I want to make sure that the agenda and the slide presentation is what's being shared with the public right now. And if I can just get a confirmation once we have that, I don't know if it's just my screen or if it's the DEM.
I'm going to put up the agenda right now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nick.
Nick.
Everyone, thank you for bearing with us. Technology in real time. Great. All right. Great. So you can see just very briefly in terms of what our time is going to be today. We're going to move through this as quickly as possible. We're doing so we can try to take as many of the questions and provide you with answers as quickly as possible. Again, we want to make sure that you have up-to-date information that supports you, your businesses, your employees, and supports the vibrancy of our city when it's time for us to begin reopening again. We know it's been extremely frustrating and extremely challenging during this time. We want to make sure that you know that we are advocating on your behalf as a city for the benefit of you, your employees, your businesses, and our neighborhoods. But we also know how exciting shared spaces can be for all of you and all of us. And so we wanted to provide this opportunity to share with you some additional details. You'll be hearing from our colleagues, the Planning Department, Robin Abad, the Director of the Shared Spaces Program at the Planning Department. He's going to give you an update on the impact of the stay-at-home order on shared spaces, as well as some of the best practices in design guidelines to help you further along the way. You're also going to be hearing from our Economic and Workforce Development team member, Darcy Bender, who runs many of our facade and tenant improvement programs, and is going to be giving an overview on how to apply for the SF Shines Shared Spaces Equity Grants. To keep it real simple, grants for your shared spaces. So before turning over the webinar to them, I just want to underscore there's a lot of information about out there right now around state restrictions, local health orders, the financial and other resources available to you. So with any questions that you may have, could I have the next slide, please?
The next slide is the ending slide.
Then don't go to that slide. But I wanted to make sure that if the number was on that slide, that we had that up there. But for those of you who can access the chat section, you will find a number shortly, which is 554-6134. In addition to, oh, thank you so much, Robin. 554-6134, and the San Francisco Office of Small Business at sfgov.org to reach out to us directly. So there are a lot of financial resources out there right now that we want to make sure that you can explore comprehensively, whether it comes from us at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. Please do reach out to us either at our website, at that number, to get a real-time information from a real person who can talk to you, or get responses through our email information as well. Just a quick update, the Payroll Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program have received new funding at the federal level. At the state level, we have the California Relief Grant, and we also have the California Rebuilding Fund. So again, a lot of different layers for grants, for low interest loan programs, as well as federal loan programs. Please be sure to reach out so you're aware of every resource that's available to you. It's better for you to apply for them as simply as possible and then to disqualify yourself and not pursue them. So please do make use of those opportunities, whether in this round or future rounds. It certainly can be beneficial. Our role right now as a city is to do everything we can to support your access to these funds and make sure that we're filling those gaps so that you and, again, your workers can be supported by many of our programs collectively that the government is providing. We've done over $24 million in loans and grants, supported over 1,200 businesses and their employees, waived an additional $5 million in fees for some of our hardest hit businesses in nightlife, entertainment, and restaurants. That's in addition to a $17.5 million allocated in direct financial relief that supported thousands of workers. And just last week, Mayor Breed announced an additional $62 million plan to provide relief for small businesses. Again, a combination of grants and loans. And again, we're seeking at the local level to fill the gaps that the state and federal government are not able to provide, or to fill gaps where there might be accessibility issues. So please do look out for that information. We will have more on that coming up in February. So please do make use of our website for that real-time information, or to reach out to us directly so we can get you that information. Before I hand it off, I just want to say again, we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Do not be shy about sharing your frustrations with us so we can better communicate with all of you and also better navigate together with all of you for our resources. We know it can be extremely confusing, extremely overwhelming, extremely cumbersome, or seemingly so. And we want to be here to help you during this time of extraordinary difficulty for our small business communities and for our city as a whole. So on behalf of the City and County of San Francisco and Mayor Breed, thank you again for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Robin.
Thank you, Director Torres and your team, Marianne and others for organizing this. And also thank you to the folks over at the Joint Information Center for pulling this together. I just want to, before I proceed, confirm that everyone sees the slides. Cool, I'm getting some nodding. All right, so technology is with us today. Great, so as Director Torres mentioned, we will go over just quickly the implications of the stay-at-home order that was implemented in the beginning of December, what it means for folks who are operating shared spaces or were operating shared spaces. My colleague Darcy will talk about grants, and then we'll get into some design guidelines, best practices. So just to recap, shared spaces take, they take place in all kinds of parts of our right-of-way in the public realm, all the way from sidewalk to the curbside to closing of entire roadways. We use these for curbside pickup, for retail and merchandising, and of course, perhaps most visibly for outdoor dining. So just as a reminder, in December 2020, San Francisco entered a more intensive stay-at-home order. And this meant that outdoor dining, which would have been allowed under the purple tier, was suspended. That suspension continues to the present time, to the present moment. So we're just going to go over 2 or 3 key questions that we've gotten over recent months to help clarify for shared spaces sponsors, how they should be operating during this time. So one of the biggest questions has been whether or not shared spaces permittees are still responsible for the shared spaces that they've built. And the short answer is that yes, please continue to monitor your installation, even though at the present time it can't be used for outdoor dining or merchandising. We really need everyone to pull together to make sure that shared spaces are clean, free of hazards, safe during this time of suspension. There's also been a question about whether or not, taking your to-go food into the shared space or allowing your patrons to take their to-go food into shared spaces is permitted. And again, we just want to make sure everyone knows that, food must be taken home and consumed in your residence. And so we're really thrilled. We're really excited that for many restaurants, to-go is still an option, of course, and folks are actively serving their communities by providing to-go food. But please discourage your patrons from hanging out in front of your brick and mortar establishment or in any shared space so that we can be consistent in tackling and ending this virus. Another question that's come up has been around music and entertainment. For shared spaces, there was a way to provide cultural activity, entertainment, music, sometimes poetry. And so as a reminder, because outdoor dining itself is suspended, obviously the provision of outdoor entertainment is also suspended. So when the stay-at-home order is lifted and we roll back into the purple tier and dining can resume, entertainment will also be allowed. So with that, I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Darcy Bender, who will talk about equity grants. And Darcy, I'll scroll through the slides for you. So just let me know when I should click through.
Great, thanks, Robin. My name is Darcy Bender, and I am with OEWD. I manage SF Shines, which is the city's storefront improvement grant program for small businesses. So we actually have 2 grant programs to help you with your shared spaces. One is the Shared Spaces Grant Equity Program, or Equity Grants Program, excuse me. And that program is specifically for businesses that have a shared spaces permit, as well as groups and organizations that have a shared spaces permit. And then there's the SF Shines for Reopening Program. And that program is only open to individual small businesses. There's the links in this presentation here. I can also put them in the chat for the links to both of those applications. You can also see that one of the differences between those programs is that the Equity Grants Program has a deadline that's approaching soon, and the SF Shines for Reopening Program is accepting applications on a rolling basis, so there is no deadline to apply for that one. So there's a couple of differences between the 2 programs that we'll go over. So first of all, for both of the programs, you should have a shared spaces permit or have at least applied for a permit before you fill out the application. It will be required for you to have a shared spaces permit in order to use these grant funds for your shared spaces. And then both programs have a $5,000 maximum per merchant. For the Shared Spaces Equity Grants program, there could be a larger amount that go to groups and organizations. And also something to note, if you apply to both programs, the $5,000 maximum still applies. So you will not receive more than $5,000 total between both programs. So there's some overlap between the two programs around what is eligible. And then there's also a few differences between the two programs. So we'll go over those next. So for both programs, the grant funds can be used for furniture, tables and chairs, barricades and diverters, and enclosures and planters, and other expenses related to your shared spaces. And for both programs, the grant funds can be used for site planning and design. However, community ambassadors and the operations and safety plans are you can only use the shared spaces equity grant funds for that.
Thank you, Darcy. So I know there are probably questions about this, and we will have time at the end for folks to ask questions about the grants, the stay-at-home order, or the design guidelines and best practices. So we'll move into the next portion and the final portion of our agenda today, which is best practices for design. The colder months have set in. I know many folks have been concerned about how they can make sure their shared spaces are still comfortable as well as safe from a COVID point of view during the rainier season, the colder season, during the season where nights are longer and there's less daylight. So we'll talk about that today. There are, in the guidelines that have been posted on our website, there are a lot of different ideas, a lot of different concepts, but today we want to focus on these 6 main ideas. That is safety around fire considerations, accessibility for those who have disabilities, sightlines and airflow, so making sure that shared spaces are still helping us mitigate transmission of the virus and operate outdoors safely, as well as neighborhood safety when it comes to sightlines. We'll also talk about the rainy season and what that means for shared spaces, and some ideas about how to make sure that your installation can continue serving during all seasons. So some basics about accessibility, is that we always want to make sure that especially folks who move around using a wheelchair are able to pass through sidewalks, without obstruction. We want to also make sure that, that path of travel is bounded or is delineated by compliant signage and other fixtures. Another requirement that is very important is to allow for fire personnel or paramedics to be able to get from the street where they might be pulled up in an ambulance or in a fire rig, a fire truck, and get to the building. So for that reason, we want every shared space, every 20 feet, to have a 3-foot gap to allow for emergency personnel to pass through that opening and gain access to the building. So we're going to look at some examples of how this looks. Here is an example of a shared space in Hayes Valley, and that you could see that about every 20 feet, there's a gap in the opening. There's an opening that's also open to the sky. So if fire department personnel need to gain access to the building and they're pulling ladders or hoses off of their truck, they're able to pass through that opening unobstructed. Here's another example of a site further south in the city. You can see that above 42 inches, you're able to see into the shared space from the street and vice versa. When standing on the sidewalk, you're also able to see through the shared space out into the street. You also see here that there is a 3-foot gap that has been provided, but it's not open to the sky. So while there's a 3-foot gap there, it would still be difficult for our emergency responder personnel to service an emergency if, say, they were having to bring a ladder onto the sidewalk. So keep in mind that a 3-foot gap also needs to be totally clear up to the sky. Here's another example for some of those concepts. So you're able to see from inside the shared space out into the street, or from the sidewalk out into the street above 42 inches above grade. You can also see that there's a 3-foot wide emergency access gap that, again, is open to the sky for maximum accessibility for fire department personnel. It's very important that paramedics and our other first responders are able to survey or see the ground floor facade of the building, all of the windows, all of the doors, and all of the openings as they're out in the street, so that they can respond quickly to save lives. There are different ways that these gaps can be treated. This is a really great example of a 3-foot gap, because it's open to the sky, again, and it has these boards that are detectable by folks who might be visually impaired, right, who can't see but could feel that on the other side of the gap they might be entering traffic. And you can also see that the way that they're attached makes them easily removable. So fire department or emergency responders could easily knock those boards out of the way if they needed to quickly gain access to the sidewalk. Here's another example of an attempt at a 3-foot gap that almost makes it, but could be better. So again, you can see that it's there, but it's not open to the sky, which impedes ladder access and accessibility. And the barriers that are used, these chains, they're not really easily detectable by maybe someone who's visually impaired or blind. And they're also a little bit fussier or more difficult to remove in the case that they need to be, sort of quickly moved out of the way. You can also see here that the address of the building behind the shared space is displayed on the front of shared space. So the numbers 419 are affixed to the facade of the shared space, letting emergency responders know what address lies behind the shared space itself. So here's a great example of a shared space that is beautiful and does look comfortable and is a beautiful addition to the neighborhood. But one key way that it could be improved and should be improved is to provide a 3-foot gap along that length. Somewhere along that 20-foot length, there needs to be a 3-foot gap that is open to the sky. Another really important thing to keep in mind, especially as we're in the colder months, when hopefully we're able to resume outdoor dining, it's probably still going to be cold because San Francisco is a chilly, foggy, windy place most of the year. When using outdoor space heaters, for example, a mushroom heater, it has to be clear of any combustible materials. We don't want anything to catch on fire, of course. And we also want to be careful not to put space heaters under canopies. They really should be clear 5 feet in all directions of any structures or materials. So propane heaters, like the ones that we commonly see, also require a permit from the fire department. And that is so that fire department personnel can help you figure out how to do this safely at your site. So here's an example of a space heater that I believe uses liquid propane gas, but you can see that it's clear in 5 feet in all directions. So this is a thumbs up. That's a green check mark. Of course, we do see space heaters under canopies. So if this is something that is happening at your site, you want to think about relocating and rearranging your space so that it's safe from the point of view of fire. Sightlines and airflow are also really important requirements, and they relate to each other. We've talked a little bit about sightlines already. You need to be able to see in and out and through shared spaces above 42 inches from the ground. That area needs to be visually clear and surveyable. At the same time, we need to make sure that there's air flowing through shared spaces. This is why we've moved activities from indoors out of doors, because it's safer to operate out of doors and reduces the transmission of COVID-19. But this means that outdoor spaces need to remain outdoors, right? They can't be fully enclosed dining booths. So here is a good example of some of the sightline and airflow ideas and how they work together. Here you have, there's obviously no canopy or roof on this shared space, but above about 42 inches, the shared space has materials that allows air to pass back and forth. Now, between dining areas, you can see that there's an acrylic panel or a clear panel that doesn't allow air to pass back and forth. And that's okay as long as two other sides, the street side and the sidewalk side, are open. Here's another great example of how sightlines and airflow are working well at a site. Above 42 inches, you can see into the street and onto the sidewalk back and forth. You can also see that there are impermeable, but also clear barriers between dining groupings. So this is acceptable because air is flowing in two directions from the sidewalk to the street, and visually you can see between the sidewalk and the street, even if there are air impermeable barriers between dining groupings. And so there's, these two things both need to happen at shared spaces. If there's no airflow, but you have visibility, it's still not really a compliant or acceptable arrangement. So we want to try and start correcting these as we move towards reopening and through reopening. So it might be a little bit hard to tell from this photograph, but we are getting visibility. You are able to see from the sidewalk out into the street if you're standing on the sidewalk or the street or vice versa. But the materials that are being used don't allow air to flow through the shared space. So here's an example of the opposite, where you have air flowing between the street and the sidewalk, but the material that's used doesn't allow you to have visibility from the sidewalk to the street, and vice versa. So here's another great example. We're getting airflow from the street to the sidewalk, but we're using materials that don't allow emergency responder personnel to have that visual connectivity. Okay, moving on to accessibility, we talked about a path for wheelchair users being very, very important to maintain at all times. And so this can be tough on San Francisco sidewalks. We know that it's not always easy because our sidewalks are narrow and many of our streets are more narrow, but it's still possible. And so it's a requirement that we must make sure that we are conscious of, so that, again, folks with wheelchairs or parents with baby strollers and all users of the street can pass safely and comfortably through the street without obstruction. So there are other things that get in the way, like poles and other fixtures that we're not able to move. So again, as you are deploying furnishings and diverters and tables and chairs on the sidewalk, make sure that somebody with a wheelchair has that 6-foot path of travel through and past your site. Another important accessibility concept is to make sure that if you are building a platform, they are not necessary, but if you are building a platform, that it's even with the grade of the sidewalk, that it meets the sidewalk at an even level. So we'll also show some examples of beautiful, effective shared spaces that don't have a platform. A platform, again, is not necessary in order for you to use the curbside lane. There's a great example of 6 feet being maintained between tables and chairs. Something, though, that could be made better in this image are diverters on either side of the chairs. So people who are using canes or who are visually impaired can detect something and aren't walking into a group of people dining. We're almost to the end here. We're going to talk about drainage and then portability. We've had some rains over the last few weeks, which happens this time of year for us. And we tend in San Francisco to get really kind of intense storms a few times a year. but their intensity, you know, can really put a strain on our streets. And so we need to make sure also that all of the shared spaces that we build in the future and the ones that we've already built start to get adjusted so that they don't impede drainage and that we're preventing flooding. So one very key detail that's very important and not difficult to implement is to make sure that along the gutter, if you do, for example, in this case, have a shared spaces platform or a deck, that it's clear, that you have a 6 by 6 inch opening that runs the entire length of the gutter so that water can pass through and towards a storm drain. So here's a really great example of how that's achieved. You know, you can see that this site doesn't use a platform, yet it's elegant, it's beautiful, it's well constructed, I think wonderfully designed, and creates a comfortable enclosure. And you can see here in this image that the gutter is clear and would allow water to flow through. One thing about this that could be easily fixed and made better is for the wall on the street side to be brought in a little bit closer so that you have that 1 foot clearance between the active travel lane and the shared space. So here's an example of something that we don't want to see and we want to start fixing. You know, a blocked drain. This causes flooding. It potentially induces damage to private property by flooding the sidewalk and then your brick and mortar establishment. So again, drainage is a small detail, but it's very, very important and can safeguard property and expense. So finally, just with movability and portability, and then we can get into questions because I know everyone has questions. Here's just some examples of how, again, a comfortable and beautiful shared space can be deployed without intensive capital investment. You know, a really expensive platform is not necessary for you to start using a curbside shared space for your business. So some great things that are depicted in this image are movable planters and barriers. If these things need to be you know, moved out of the way because there is an emergency with, say, a sewer line or a water line, or the street has been scheduled for repaving or some other, you know, infrastructure work, this material can be quickly moved or set aside and then put back out without any expense whatsoever. So we really encourage folks to consider, you know, low cost and easy to deploy, easy to remove investments in your sites. Here's another site of, you know, this has got a little bit more of a reuse aesthetic to it, but nonetheless is an effective barrier that meets all of the criteria we have for airflow and protection from traffic and all of those other considerations. So some really playful and beautiful examples of how this can be done really well. Another example in the inner Sunset. And you can see here how the creativity that the folks at Underdogs have used. And they also provide that 3 foot gap every 20 feet. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Director Torres, who is going to facilitate our question and answer. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you, Darcy. I believe we have the owner of Underdogs on the line right now, so that was a nice shout out to Doug. Quick question in terms of the slides and the presentation, Robin, will those be made available to individuals so they can share them with their constituencies? And what's the best way for them to get access to that?
Yes, absolutely. We will post them on our website, and we'll also email everyone who's signed up for this webinar with a link to get the PDF of the slides we just looked at. And I believe this is also being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live. So there's many different ways for folks to tune back into this info if they weren't able to make it today or want to revisit any of the content.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. We have some nitty-gritty questions here. So if the curb is lower than 6 inches high, how should I do the platform?
Great question. You should try and maintain as much openness as possible between the gutter and the top of the curb. So that would be if you want to do a platform. We'd encourage you to experiment with other ideas if you can, but just trying to maintain as much of an opening along that entire curve as possible is going to be good for helping to prevent flooding.
Great. Thanks, Robin. And please, we aren't seeing that many questions. So if you even have one that you think would be useful to hear, please do just put it in the chat section and we can get the conversation moving. Here's another one for you, Robin. If we don't have a diverter yet, do we need to remove the tables and chairs right away until we have the diverters? Or can we continue to use them while working to get the diverters?
Yes, please work towards getting a diverter as soon as possible. We don't want to stop anyone from operating because we know how critical
There are no
operating
questions 'cause they're all
outdoors.
sending them to me, and I'm not keeping up with
Just a quick,
copying and
quick
pasting.
note,
There are so many.
and to some folks at the JIC, it is a great communication stage. Just want to make sure that folks are staying on mute so that Robin can answer some of these nitty-gritty questions. Thanks. Robin, please.
Yeah, so please get diverters as soon as possible. And this is not only for the safety of those who are dining, at your shared space, but it's also out of consideration and respect and the safety of those in our community who are mobility impaired, right, or who are visually impaired. That helps everyone use the street and the sidewalk safely. We're not going to actively shut anyone down, but we are expecting that everybody is, doing what's necessary to keep everyone safe.
Great, thank you, Robin. If there is this is along the same lines. If there is a violation, typically how long will someone have to correct that?
That's a great question. So it can depend on how severe the issue is. So, one example that I can think of is we've seen on occasion folks storing propane gas, liquid propane gas, big containers, out in their shared space. That's very unsafe, especially out in the street, out in the public realm. And so we would expect something like that to be remedied immediately, right? Other things that might take more time to implement, I think we want to be flexible about, for example, fixing your platform or your deck if it's not entirely level, maybe modifying the barriers or screens around your shared space so that you get better airflow and better visibility. We can be a little bit more flexible about that. And I think we just want to see that folks are working towards that, right? And so we appreciate that everyone is keeping up with these guidelines, given all the other stresses that you have in your life right now. But this will help us control, again, COVID and make sure that these sites are safe for use by everyone.
Great, thank you, Robin. We'll switch over to Darcy. Just a couple questions for you, and then I'll come back to you, Robin. There's some more questions for shared spaces directly as well. When will the grants be distributed, Darcy? And is there a way for people to check their status?
Sure. So for the SF Shines for Reopening grants, awards are going out every 2 weeks. That's how often we do the rolling review. And you should be receiving updates from the sfshines@sfgov.org email address every 2 weeks with your current status. Robin, I think you can speak to the Shared Spaces Equity Grant Program.
So if you applied to the Shared Spaces Equity Grant Program, we will let you know by the middle of February at the latest as to your status. Just as a reminder, the deadline for that is January 31 at 11:30 p.m. And so, we had originally hoped that it might, or intended for it to be open and rolling, but in order to get funds out there as soon as possible, we decided to put a deadline on it. And we'll get back to people by mid-February at the latest in terms of their status.
Great, thank you both. I have another one that's about, the San Francisco topography. What kind of exceptions are there for building on top of lanes with a steep graded hill? 42 inches from the ground is a huge difference end to end for us. Also, our curbside is only 3 inches high, which makes it difficult to provide clearance.
Yes, you know, San Francisco is a hilly place with a lot of steep streets and a lot of narrow sidewalks. And so the reality is that shared spaces won't always work in front of your brick and mortar business. And unfortunately, that's the reality that we're all living in. You know, if a street is very, very steep and you aren't able to provide some kind of, for example, ADA equivalent facility, then you know, it just doesn't work, unfortunately. Same is true for very narrow sidewalks, right? We can't block up the sidewalk with tables and chairs at the expense of other users of the streets who definitely need to pass through and pass around. What I will say is that some neighborhoods have been very innovative and creative in collaborating with their neighbors, either other business owners nearby or a group of neighbors coming together to maybe close a nearby street on the weekends, or take over a surface parking lot nearby that hasn't been used. So there are still ways for you all to access a shared space or create a shared space that aren't necessarily directly in front of your brick and mortar frontage. So that's another solution we've seen people take advantage of, and that's been really successful in some places. Again, with the curb being low, that also happens. Sidewalks and streets are imperfect. Not all of them are the same. But the principle, again, is just try and maintain drainage. So we don't want to block up that area directly next to the curb. So there are many different ways to address that. And I think as long as there's an opening, stormwater is allowed to pass through, you know, we're doing good.
Great. If a business has already built out a site, but that site is non-compliant with city guidelines, can they still apply for a grant to bring it into compliance?
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons that we created the grants programs, were to help people, you know, improve their shared spaces sites, open a new site, but also make improvements so that they are safe and accessible.
Great. For neighborhoods with open public spaces where folks do gather safely to sit and sometimes enjoy their takeout meals, should people that are responsible for those stewarded spaces, should they be posting signs asking people right now not to sit in those areas, or is that something that's still allowed right now?
So outdoor dining of any kind in the public realm or in public space is suspended per our state health guidelines. So yes, please discourage any of your patrons taking takeout food from taking that to your shared space and consuming it on the premises. We do have signage. There was one image of it in the presentation. I should have called that out. Thank you, Maria de Alva, for designing that. And that signage will be posted on our website for anyone to be able to download and print. And our community education and response teams will also be passing those out to try and get signage up on shared spaces, reminding patrons that you know, it's really not safe right now to be dining outdoors in public space. And we really appreciate all of you as shared spaces operators, especially those doing takeout, you know, reminding people about the protocols.
Great. And then just a reminder, I was seeing that I'm getting some direct messages in the chat section from individuals. I think some individuals didn't know where the Q&A moderator was. So please do send those questions directly to me. It should be listed there. If you can't find it, please do add that back into the chat section and our team will take care of that. Are there fees for the fire department permit currently?
I actually don't know at the present time whether or not there are fees for fire department permits. I don't believe at the moment that we have anyone from the fire department with us. I'm just scrolling through the list of attendees. So apologies everyone for not having clarity about that. We will follow up in our email with everyone who signed up with this for this webinar with specifics about the state of fire department's fees.
Great. Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. Yeah, so please do continue to send those to me directly, Joaquin Torres on the site, and I will answer I will guide these questions as quickly as I possibly can. They're starting to come in now. Here we go. What are the chances that the Shared Spaces program will become permanent?
Oh, this is a great question. So in October, Mayor Breed did announce that elements of the shared spaces would move from an emergency response program into one that is a permanent part of the city's toolbox for economic recovery and for the revitalization of our public spaces. So the mayor's office, Mayor Breed's office, as well as department heads are working on this right now. The Board of Supervisors also I believe it was, and I don't precisely remember, it was either in September or October, did pass a resolution to this effect as well. So there is, broad support and movement towards making this a permanent part of our toolbox for helping small businesses and neighborhood commercial corridors.
Great. Here's just a comment for us to be aware of. The fee for heaters is $375. At least that's what this individual paid. Thank you, Ricardo. That must be paid up front before they come out and do the inspection. So just something for us to think about in terms of our responses and the value of these grants. Bringing in a platform in 12 inches would force complete rebuilding of our shared space. Is this a real necessary priority for us to fix this?
I think long-term, we want to make sure, again, that shared spaces and the way they occupy the street keep everyone safe. And so the reason that there should be a 12-foot clearance or setback from the active travel lane serves many purposes. It makes sure it helps to make sure that those who are operating motor vehicles, whether that's a car or a delivery truck or a bus, have adequate safety from the shared space. And the folks who are occupying the shared space, right, your patrons are also as safe as possible as they're out in the street, in the road. So we do want to move towards making sure that we hit as many of these safety criteria as possible. This is another reason why we urge, especially those folks who are considering creating a shared space, maybe who don't already have one, to really look closely at the design guidelines and to create enclosures that can be moved or modified if needed. The requirements that we have, especially from the state at this time, have continued to change, right, over the 6 months, the last 6 months. As we've learned more about the virus and the science, we've deepened our knowledge scientifically about how the virus is transmitted and how it behaves. Those are all things that have shaped public health guidelines and are reflected in our design guidelines. So we're probably going to have to keep modifying our spaces to make them viable and safe. And so for that reason, as you're making decisions about investments, either modifying a current site that you have or starting a new one, keep that in mind. Keep in mind that in order to continue operating outdoors in a safe manner, we might have to sort of tweak and change things continually over the next year.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robin. Darcy, I have a grant process transparency question for you. So Andrew, thank you for this. If we have already applied for a Shared Spaces Equity Grant in December 2020, do we need to reapply? We received a confirmation email that said we will update all applicants via email every 2 weeks. We may not be able to award you in the same cycle that you applied. There's still some more here, 1 second. This seems to contradict what was just announced or just said, that this would not be a rolling grant. Darcy, you're on.
Sure. So you do not need to reapply for either program if you have submitted an application in the past. I think as Robin mentioned earlier, the program was originally intended to be accepting applications on a rolling basis, but it has since switched to being one that has a deadline. All applications will be reviewed and then you'll be notified of the decision after that. So you do not need to reapply to either program. If you have applied to the SF Shines for Reopening program, you do not need to submit another application. Feel free to reach out to the email sfshines@sfgov.org if you need to make any changes to your application, but you do not need to resubmit an application.
If you could go ahead and put that email in the chat section, Darcy, I think that would be good, just to have something that's easily accessible for people.
Sure.
Okay, so another question. We have 2 restaurants that have curbside structures that are already built, yet we're one company. We want to apply for the equity grant for these structures. Do we apply for a grant as 2 separate restaurants? Is it up to $500,000 for each restaurant, or for our whole company? When I looked at the application, it seems as though we should apply for each restaurant separately. Is that correct?
So for the SF Shines for Reopening grant, you can submit an application for each location. So every single storefront is able to submit an application. Robin, do you have for the Shared Spaces Equity Grant, do you have an answer for that?
Yes, so the same applies for the Shared Spaces Equity Grant. So if you're applying to either the SF Shines or the Shared Spaces Equity Grants, one application per business or storefront.
Thank you, Robin. Here's another just quick reminder. Where will we be able to rewatch this recorded video session later? So in say 1 hour, or say in 2 hours, someone wants to access the video. Again, where do they go to access it?
Would Nick or Diana from the JIC be able to answer that question?
Yeah,
I know it's posted, but I'm not sure where.
Nick or Diana, if you could just include in the chat section for everyone to see where people can look or where people can go to gain access to this recorded video later on. Here's another question. Are the grants only going to be available to businesses that are in legacy neighborhoods or to minority-owned small businesses? There were questions on the grant applications about this.
That's a good question. So for the SF Shines for Reopening grant, the demographic information that was requested is just informational. Even information about the tenure of your business is just for our tracking purposes and will not be a consideration in review of the applications. Robin, is that the same for the?
For the equity grants, they are open to all neighborhoods and all businesses, and I think we are, considering how different maybe neighborhoods and demographics have been impacted differently by the coronavirus. So it's something that's a consideration, but is by no means a criteria.
Yeah, I should note just really quick for the SF Shines for Reopening grant, the neighborhood that you're located in does have a bearing on how much the size of your grant award. So $2,000 is the maximum grant award in most areas of the city, but select neighborhoods do have a maximum award of $5,000.
Great, thank you, Darcy and Robin. 1 second. Can you go over what curbside structures need to be movable? I have a fixed structure on the street and missed the first part of what you mentioned, Robin.
Right. So I think the general principle is that you can think about is whatever I'm putting out in the curbside something that can be easily moved or modified in case of, say, emergency, or again, if public health kind of design guidelines change. And so I would just calibrate your kind of the degree of your investment, keeping that in mind, right? Sometimes sewer laterals break, or gas lines or water laterals break. That certainly happened under our pre-COVID parklets. And so, that needs to be serviced, right? So having movable barriers, planters, maybe things that are on lockable wheels, or might be stationary but can be moved, 2 or 3 people can sort of move things around, is highly advisable. It also probably means that you are not having to think about issues of drainage and to accommodate some of those pretty technical aspects of, of design and construction. So that's just something to keep in mind as you move forward.
Great. We have about 4 minutes. I'm gonna try to cover 2 more areas. Just to note that Marianne Thompson put the information about when the video recordings will be made available, so you can send those out on our OEWD Facebook page. Marianne will provide that link as well for us. In addition to the shared spaces page, we'll also include where these videos can be found. On lighting, electrical lighting, and then in addition, when can people expect to take advantage of this program again in terms of when will we not need signage moving forward? I can answer a little bit of that later on, but first, I've read about lighting connection requirements, but are there additional approvals required for electrical lighting?
So at the present time, of course, lighting is it's allowed as long as the way that you are getting electrical power to, say, the curbside is done in a safe manner. And so things that we don't want to see that make it really difficult for fire department personnel, especially to work with ladders, are cables that are strung across the sidewalk. So an extension cord or string lights that go that are attached to the building facade and then attached to the shared space is really not an ideal situation. It really can be an impediment to our first responders to do their jobs effectively and quickly. So in our design guidelines, there are some suggestions for how you can get electrical power temporarily out to your shared space. That's along the sidewalk under a tray that a wheelchair could go over safely, right? So these trays or these kind of cable covers are very common. We see them used at street fairs and at concerts, and they're easily accessible features they're very inexpensive solutions for you to be able to run a power cable from your brick and mortar out to the curbside. So check those design guidelines out for a specification for that.
Great. So for Darcy, is it possible to add a second, or actually, I think it's for both of you, is it possible to add a secondary contact field to the shared spaces application itself? I think it's more for consideration than an answer right now if you can't answer.
Sure. I would say email the SF Shines email address and I can make changes to the application.
Great. Thanks, Katie. And thank you, Darcy, for that answer. Once we get to a point where we can start seeing additional activity from shared spaces, people in these spaces, once again, will the city continue to waive fees for sidewalk and street space permits, Robin?
Well, there are a number of different fees, some of which currently have waivers in place due to legislation. So for example, sidewalk tables and chairs permits are waived through 2022. The city won't begin assessing any fees or potentially start charging those until the calendar year 2023. For shared spaces for the foreseeable future, certainly through the end of this fiscal year through June, of course, everyone has permits that don't have any fees associated with them. So we're very much focused on sort of like the near and immediate term in the midterm on economic recovery, right? And creating an operating environment for small businesses to not only survive this extreme moment of crisis, but then also to come out of this really thriving. Eventually post-pandemic, sort of post-economic recovery, we'll think about a sensible kind of fee structure for the use of, public space for private or commercial activity. Sort of in the very long term, we're all of us are thinking of that, but for the meantime, we're not expecting anyone to pay a permit fee for a shared space.
Great. This is a last point, I think, for Katie as well. Is the city able to help with traffic calming interventions to support the shared spaces on a corridor? For example, specifically 3rd Street, the speed and street design make it difficult to create those safe parking lane sites.
That's an excellent question, Katie, and you call out the fact that there are many different uses and demands on our streets, many different ways of getting around, and there are many different tools too for addressing that through shared spaces or slow streets. or the installation of facilities like bicycle lanes or other facilities that make it safer to move around by other modes. So I can't speak for our MTA, but I can say that shared spaces are part of a larger toolbox, right, that helps us address mobility and safety in our neighborhoods. So we are thinking about how all of these different tools and all of these different approaches and solutions can work together to support both economic recovery and safe mobility through our city.
Great, thank you, Robin. One final question. What are the liabilities for cleanup in the event of revoking the shared spaces permit or a restaurant closure, bankruptcy, etc.?
Yeah, in general, the principle is that, everyone's responsible for what they put out in the street, whether they're currently actively operating or in the unfortunate circumstance that, closure is extended. And so, that's something to keep in mind, again, as we move forward with shared spaces, as folks are using this program to support their livelihoods. We want to make sure that we're making investments that we can, control and account for in the long term. So, if for some reason, some unfortunate circumstance, someone has to close or relocate, we do expect that you're going to take care of the installation that you've put out in the street.
Great, thank you, Robin. Everyone, we're about a little bit over time right now. I think the last questions were all related in terms of when are we going to be allowed to start seeing fewer restrictions, additional activities, both outside and inside, so we can start seeing that economic activity take place for your benefit, for our city's benefit, that it will all be determined based on the public health information and guidance that we receive. That being said, the state is pursuing what will inevitably allow us to move forward with moving into a less restrictive tier. We are currently looking at what we will be specifically allowing once we do move into that less restrictive tier. We are pursuing and considering outdoor activities, including the benefit to shared spaces and outdoor dining as part of that, but we don't have the details yet. Those will be forthcoming, but we don't have those details yet. It's a very dynamic environment. We're discussing that locally, we're discussing that at the state level, and once we have that information to provide to all of you, we will do so. We don't have that just yet, but we are pursuing it. So just want to make sure that I know it's not a certain answer. I know it's not a specific timeline for any of you. I wish that we could say that right now, but we just don't have that in place just yet. In terms of a final question, sorry, are you able to confirm that jam permits do not require renewal? And again, with regards to additional outdoor activities taking place, those will be determined. We'll do another webinar as soon as we have additional information on what additional allowances can take place, but we will come back with more information once we have confirmed information and approach to allowing additional activities once we can start doing that again outside. Any final comments from you, Robin or Darcy, before we go? Anything that kind of bubbled up in your mind that you want to share with those who joined us today?
Well, I just want to thank everyone in the small business community for the leadership and the perseverance. We know how difficult this is. Your city team and advocates are doing everything that we can to try and provide tools and opportunities for you to get through this and to keep supporting your families. So thank you for all of that leadership that you've shown in your own communities. We also know how challenging it's been for you all to keep up with the changing environment, different rules and regulations, all the stuff that's come up as we learn more about the virus. So just know that your city team is here for you, and we're really grateful for all of the collaboration and the partnership that you've shown San Francisco is going to get through this, and we know that small business is like the backbone of our local economy. So we'll definitely get through this.
Great, thank you so much, Robin. And to all of you, please do take advantage of our Office of Economic and Workforce Development website, oewd.org, where you will find information across the board around the resources for you as small business owners, the numbers that you can call to reach people that can answer your questions, or emails that you can send your questions to and get responses. Please do make use of us and know that we are advocating as an office to get movement as quickly as possible and to make sure that we are prepared so that once we're allowed to move in those directions, we can. Because we know exactly how important increasing every single line item of revenue, how important that is for all of you. So please do continue your advocacy. Please do continue asking us questions. Please, please, please continue that engagement. It helps us make our response, our program design, and our eventual programs even better. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Robin, again, at ShareSpaces, the planning department, for all of your work and leadership, Darcy Bender at OEWD, for all of your leadership in making sure that our programs can move forward, and of course to the JIC and the entire Joint Information Center, all of you for the translation, the support that was provided today. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you for joining the Best Practices webinar for Shared Spaces. For more information, please contact Marianne Thompson at marianne.thompson@sfgov.org. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.